जिस इलाके को आप जानते हैं उसी में ऑर्डर हासिल करें। यांगो ऐप के माई एरिया फीचर से अपना इलाका चूज करें।
Hello there, and a warm welcome to this, the Q&A show, 263rd round of Q&A that we've done. And, well, let's go straight to it. Let's introduce the panel. Hello, Oliver McKenzie.
Yes, Rich, you've got questions. Hopefully I've got some answers.
We shall see.
This fine Monday morning.
And Alex Battaglia, hello.
Yeah, no promises about how good our answers are, but they will be there.
Right, okay, yes. I notice you're back in Doom Guy mode there.
Yeah, that's just going to be the way things are from now on until it gets better.
Treadmill action
treadmill.
there. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay, the silent disco returns. Good stuff. All of which will make no sense at all to our podcast listeners, so apologies for that. DF Direct Weekly is brought to you in partnership with Alienware. The latest state-of-the-art Alienware Area 51 delivers a flagship reborn with a focus on extreme high-quality design, cutting-edge silicon and thermal precision, and it's available now. In addition to top-end GPUs, the new Area 51 also supports AMD's Ryzen 9000 X3D processors, from the 9800 X3D up to and including the new 9950 X3D2. Ryzen 9000 X3D processors deliver by far and away the best CPU gaming performance we've tested to date and are a key recommendation for a high-spec gaming PC. And to keep performance sustained at the highest level, Alienware has overhauled the internals with a new gasket architecture. The system uses a combination of 180 and 140 millimeter fans to create positive pressure, moving 25% more air while remaining 45% quieter than prior generations. Combined with a 1500 watt platinum PSU and enough thermal headroom to handle the 600 watt power draw of the RTX 5090, the new Area 51 is built for the absolute limit of modern PC gaming. This one comes from Slowmar, and there's another question from David Clements, which is kind of like the same thing, or adjacent anyway, so let's crack on. Hello, digital fundamentalistas, exclamation point. I can't help but giggle every time Alex gets asked a Nintendo Switch 2 question. Seems like the rest of you tend to at least raise an eyebrow to what it's doing. Lately, another competitor has been doing shorts of Pragmata on Switch 2 side by side with a PC 5080 with all the path tracing, amazing flowing hair goodies. Here's my question. Is fancy hair and glowy signs really worth $2,000 more? Are we really looking at fundamental differences in the gaming experience? How about Call of Duty, rumoured to be ditching X-Bone and PS4, but also part of the Activision acquisition deal to bring it to Nintendo? Don't get me wrong, I'd love to play games with a 5090 any chance I've got, but does the performance really change the game? Almost feels like the debate between hardcover and paperback. Does the story/experience really change fundamentally? Adjacent to that, this question from David Clements. Do you ever wonder if perhaps we should chill out about the advancements of graphics in games? I mean, with costs flying through the roof on development of games and the smaller studios not having the budgets to keep up, should we actually not forget that, in fact, most people don't know if something is ray-traced versus screen-spaced, path-traced versus rat-raced, etc. The average gamer isn't concerned with RTGI or RTAO or whatever other acronyms we could add. I don't want to constantly be chasing the latest graphics in games because that costs us all a fortune. I'd be happy with PS5 games looking the way they do for many years to come. PC owners can't surely afford another £500 graphics card upgrade every so often when the latest advancements occur either on top of their CPU and RAM costs. So, Alex, what do you want to make of this one? It is the sort of age-old question about, does higher-end graphics actually mean anything these days? And I think there's a fairly clear answer to that.
I mean, in regards, if you're putting a Switch 2 next to a 5080 or a 5090, the answer is yes. There's no going around that. There is a very large fundamental difference in a lot of games. A lot of Switch 2 games are barely 60 FPS if they're ports from AAA studios, whereas on a PC, the reaction time and visual fluidity of just without even better graphics is way higher. So these are, fundamental things, and the whole deal is whether or not you care. And in the case of Slomar, maybe you don't care, so it doesn't matter to you. But to a lot of people who do want to give out more money for their gaming purchases, well, then they maybe do care a bit more, and then they suitably invest in it. I wouldn't say it's the difference between a hardcover and a paperback, because the words are still the same, but this would be like if half the words were maybe missing, or, in the case of like Pragmata's hair, like an entire character was just like not as fleshed out in the book, for example.
Right.
So there are actually differences there in terms of content, which are pretty important to get across.
Maybe it's the case that the paperback has got like really small and difficult to read words.
Yes, which is the case in some books, actually. So bigger volumes are actually better. So with regard to David Clement's answer, what I would say here is, I think a lot of people overestimate the cost that it takes a developer to implement things like RTGI and RTAO or path tracing. We've recently seen that developers, like the developers behind F1 EA Codemasters, said it took 2 engineers about a year or so to implement path tracing in their engine, which is like a super premier experience for a lot of people on PC, versus the cost of having a whole bunch of artists and artists designing and making really complex props to be posted across levels that have very different like biomes or scenery. That's the most expensive stuff in modern game development tends to be asset design and asset making. And that has nothing to do with RTGI or RTAO. But for the gamer, I mean, a lot of people don't care about the technical aspect behind certain things that work or don't work, but they do like it when it looks better and maybe runs better. And this is probably the friction point with RT, where it's been a technology that required a lot more general graphical compute power to actually be running well. And as a result of that, people didn't like the idea. It wasn't like in the past, it was all about just increasing the amount of pixels and the fluid frame rate while using the exact same techniques almost for a full decade, right? But then something revolutionary came along that said, no, the paradigm's different, and it's going to actually cost for a while.
Right.
As a result of that, I think people have a very different view of those things, but in general, they will make a game look better. It's just a matter of whether or not you want to shill out the money for that. And I don't think a lot of people with the current market will actually want to do that because it has, like David says here, gotten ridiculously expensive to buy a new GPU or buy a PS5 Pro for that matter. So that's kind of where we are.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is the case that most people, let's take, for example, Pragmata, it would, most people would be absolutely fine with the PlayStation 5 version, maybe even the Series S and Switch 2 versions, because fundamentally you are getting the same story slash experience. It's just the more you want to invest in your hardware, the better the experience you'll get. And it is to the point where, I genuinely think that the PS5 Pro version presents in a much more pleasing manner than the base PlayStation 5 version. I mean, it's, put them side by side in real world terms. And the difference will be significantly more pronounced by looking at a YouTube short where somebody's done the same thing. That's one of the things that we constantly sort of have to deal with, is the fact that a lot of the differences you do see in real life but don't look great on compressed video when you're sort of only seeing half of each screen. Yeah, tricky one though, because, Pragmata, you can still play it on Switch 2 and it's still a decent experience. The frame rate's a bit wobbly, you're losing some of the features, but, you can take it on the go. That's something you can't really do on the other systems. So, plus and minus points, horses for courses. Oliver, what's your take?
Yeah, I do feel like looking at a side-by-side is maybe underselling the extent of the differences a little bit, because they show up a lot more in motion when you have a fully unlocked frame rate, essentially on Switch 2. Much of the time does not look very good. I think that's actually the main concern. I would kind of agree that, like, even, PS5 versus Pro, PS5 is still a good-looking experience in that title, but I think the constant frame rate drops just put a huge damper on Switch 2. in that title. And in general, like when you look at games across Switch 2 and high-end PC, we're talking about very high frame rates. Switch 2, we're usually talking about 30 FPS in current generation software. For the most part, which is not very good, or in the case of Pragmata, a very unstable frame rate that you wish was 30 FPS, perhaps it's in some cases. That's not too positive. In terms of like how transformative RT can be in some of these titles, I mean, RT, it depends. In some games, it's like very additive over the base lighting. In Pragmata, I think you have a good RT experience and a good, reasonably good non-RT experience. Some games it makes a big difference. I mean, it just depends on the title, of course. Look at a UE5 title like Talos Principle 2. That's a huge difference, obviously, between the non-RT and RT lighting paths. Can be very large differences there. But I guess there's another question, which is like, is it worth $2,000? Spending $2,000 more on a high-end PC? Perhaps not, but that's going to be up to the beholder. I think the second question here is a little bit more interesting, perhaps. I do think that there is like a bit of a push to make more meaningful ways to scale graphics in a meaningful way, in a way that is significant to the end user. Where, like Alex said, you know, a low proportion of the amount of development time that's spent in the game could be spent iterating on RT features that maybe work with the existing art and existing assets and don't actually need that much tweaking or artist time. Over the long term, I think that we're going to see other ways of making games much cheaper to make and work on. But I honestly think a big part of it is just going to be the fact that next generation, we're going to see this attempt to target very many specs with games, and games are just going to have to scale much more than they used to. So perhaps that high-end feature set will have even less of a cost than it does today.
Yeah, it was like the question we had last week about the potential that the non-raid-faced paths might actually not look that great. Kind of like this transition point. There have been several titles where I think the raid facing is genuinely what the developers wanted to have as part of the visual makeup of the game, and when you take them away, it looks a bit odd. Going, you know, Pragmata again, the RT reflections. You do have a fallback with screen space reflections, but they look poor. They look really, really poor. But you know, it is there. Yeah, it's an interesting one because the way things are going is that, you know, the PlayStation 5 won't be going away anytime soon. If you're happy with your PlayStation 5 games looking the way they do for many years to come, I've got good news for you. You're still going to be getting the same games coming. The thing is, though, at some point, maybe you think maybe it's, you know, this doesn't look so good. And maybe you'll be watching Digital Foundry and seeing things that, okay, maybe I want to buy into that. You know, I guess the point is that there is going to be a huge amount of scalability going forward, and it's up to the user to choose when they want to upgrade or not upgrade, I guess. Okay, let's move on. I'm going to group together another couple of questions here, which are to do with Switch 2. Shylink asks, hi gents, do you think the Switch 2 price bump means we should expect a longer wait for any premium, quote-unquote, premium SKU? The most desired upgrades, like a new screen and larger battery, aren't directly affected by Ramageddon, but at the same time, Nintendo probably figures consumers won't be lining up to buy an even more expensive product after the price of the base model was just raised. Are we stuck with a Switch 2 with a battery that can't even last through an extended layover for the foreseeable future? Dajar Kerr in brackets, Dan. Happy half fortnight, lads. There's a lot of noise this week about the inevitable Switch 2 price rise. However, if you put your ear to the ground and listen for the buffaloes, they reveal that Nintendo's latest financial reports showed a surge of almost 24% in R&D spending, which is also projected to rise further in 2027. The last time Ninty had the oven set this hot, a fresh console popped out the following year. Looking at Samsung 4nm, and in April it was reported that yields hit the magic 80% mark, and in the current context of price hikes adding further climatic incentives, could we be seeing a budget quote-unquote light console sooner rather than later? How would you read the tea leaves? Well, that's an interesting point. You've got sort of two sides of the spectrum there. On the one hand, yes, if your base console is going to get more expensive, then the concept of producing an even more expensive model isn't particularly great. On the other hand, if there is this R&D splurge and the potential to actually shrink the processor and potentially cost reduce it, you could end up with what effectively we had on Switch 1, which was a replacement model. Oliver, what would you like to see, and what do you think is going to happen?
Well, I'd love to see a SOLED model with good HDR and a class-leading screen. That'd be a top priority of mine, because at the moment, I mean, obviously the issues with motion persistence on the Switch 2 display have been well documented, but I also just think like a lot of games look a lot better on TV owing to the fact that they have good HDR support. That isn't really something you see on the handhelds. That's quite unfortunate, I would say. I actually think there's a different way to look at this question, which is that Nintendo is presumably quite concerned about higher Switch 2 prices. But I think that there is an opportunity for Nintendo here to develop and to iterate on hardware that can actually make them a profit. Because if you look at the current Switch unit, I don't know that Nintendo is making much money or any money selling a Switch 2 at $450 or $500. I don't really think that's a money-making proposition for them. I think that a Switch 2 OLED at $600 or $650 or whatever it might be would make them some money on the other hand, because you look at the cost of components, maybe the screen costs them 15, 20 bucks more, 25 bucks more, like it's not that much money. And you put in a die string processor and maybe an extra 256 gigs of memory or extra 256 gigs of storage or something. I think they're netting out a fair bit of money there. But I do think there is a bit of a difference, a bit of a sticker shock between like SWOLED 1 at $350 and SWOLED 2 at like, above $500, presumably like $600. That's quite shocking. So who knows? I don't actually think a bigger battery is what you want. I think you just want a more efficient processor there. But yeah, and then in terms of the other question, Nintendo is spending more on R&D. That is interesting detail, but we don't really know what that means. I think it's probably a safe bet to say there will be more Switch 2 family revisions coming, probably new models, but we don't know whether they're blowing money on SoC revisions or new accessories or proof of concept work or Switch 3 or God only knows. Nintendo's kind of a black box, and they have so many different hardware products that they launch throughout the course of a generation that you got to be thinking there are probably some of those in the mix as well. But I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a Switch 2 Lite model, or indeed like a Switch 2 home console unit or something similar like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting thought there. Alex, what do you think?
Well, yeah, I think Switch 2, like Oliver says, there are like limits to the current hardware when in terms of the screen, which would be nice to see in an update. But the amount of people that would actually go out and buy it versus the original Switch model, I think that might be long-term converts who maybe were waiting to buy a Switch 2 at some point, and then people who would just be upgrading from their current Switch, so people who are double dipping on the same thing. I'm not certain if that is the right thing to do right now, given the current price rise of the Switch 2's base model. But the idea of a cheaper Switch 2 in some capacity does sound interesting to me, but I'm not sure how quickly Nintendo could get around to it unless they had it planned longer term already anyway, because of projections of price based upon RAM. They're smart business people there, so presumably they did think about that ahead of time, much like Xbox thought about it ahead of time in like the 2020 season. And in this case, that would be cool to see. I'm not exactly sure how they would cost reduce it in such a great way, other than getting rid of if it is really that expensive, like the dock. I always feel like the dock is really cheap. Like getting rid of the dock and then making the screen even worse, or I mean, I don't know what the cost reduction looks like there. And for it to be meaningful enough to reduce the price enough to make it worthwhile for a consumer to see the differentiation. So that's where I actually kind of wonder what it is that it could be if it is a cost-reduced model, because I actually have trouble imagining it. But then again, I have a limited capacity to imagine things, and a whole boardroom full of business people might have a better idea than I do.
Yeah, I think, the chances of there being revised models in development is probably a certainty, like 99.9%. I mean, they did it with the first Switch, right? They produced the original model, and then they had the die shrink. And then from that die shrink, you got a replacement to the original, which was presumably cheaper for them to make. Whether it would be in this case, uncertain. Then they had the Lite model, which was a cost-reduced version, lower levels of functionality. But, it did the job, right? It was a handheld. No need for detachable Joy-Cons, no need for a dock, that sort of thing. That's an option that would be open to them. And then you had the premium model as well. And I do think, there is an appetite amongst a certain part of the audience for a more premium experience on the Switch 2, and there's a lot of options they could do there. The OLED panel being, obviously coming to the fore there. How would I read the tea leaves? Well, whether those things come to market is another thing. Whether those things are, a game changer, just don't really know. Yeah, difficult. Final thoughts, Oliver?
I honestly think, Nintendo's recent earnings had them at almost 20 million sell-through of Switch 2 units, I think, through the end of March, I believe. They're selling a lot of Switch 2 units. I kind of wonder if maybe their internal thinking is like, okay, actually, we're building a platform quickly enough here. Let's just try to expand at the top end of that segment a little bit and sell people, a mix of new consoles and accessories that actually do generate a hardware profit for Nintendo. Because I think Nintendo has leaned into the same strategy that like Sony has leaned into and Microsoft has leaned into, of basically selling you a razor, and then making money on the blades. It's not been Nintendo's model historically, but I actually don't think they're making a significant profit on the hardware anymore. So I think an opportunity to make that money back on a higher end unit that might net them a profit of like, some $80, $70, whatever per console sold. That is probably actually a fairly tantalizing prospect, even if the sticker shock might be extraordinary for a lot of gamers. The fact that you'd have a significant fraction of gamers who would buy a console like that and mix it into some money could be quite tantalizing, I think.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay, let's move on. Question here from Teasing Hilarity. What-o, forgers of the digital realm! Exclamation point. In Nintendo's earnings calls this week, Furukawa indicated an intention for Switch 2 to have a lifespan similar to Switch 1. This would see it remaining Nintendo's primary console well into the early 2030s. Right now, there's a narrower gap when compared to current consoles than in the Switch 1 era, and we're seeing the benefits of this with the great third-party support out of the gate. I think this is one of the big attractions for the console, helping to drive its initial popularity. However, once the next gen hits, potentially within the next year, the gap will again widen, which could harm the third-party picture. With talk of a longer cross-gen period this time around, how do you think the Switch 2 would fare if it lasted another 6 to 7 years? And is that really reasonable to expect? Thank you, and have a good week to you all. Alex, I'm not particularly worried about it this time around for some reason. Yeah. I think primarily because the Switch 2 SoC is a relatively a lot better than the Switch 1 SoC. And secondly, the direction of travel in the industry is such that it's all about getting games onto as many platforms as possible. Or have I got it wrong?
I think you've got it right. And I think, for example, the Switch 1 in a lot of ways was technically inferior, not just in terms of how powerful it was, but it was also technically inferior versus something like a PS4, which could do things like async compute. The Switch 1 could not do that, Right. Versus this time around, a Switch 2 is actually in many ways much more technologically advanced than a PS5. It can actually do proper full mesh shading. It can do machine learning. It has actual real ray tracing acceleration, not the junky RDNA 2 stuff. That's all awesome stuff that allows it to scale and actually get ports of software in a way that the Switch 1 never could. And here, like Rich said, everyone, when the next generation of consoles comes out, due to their expense and the lengthy development time of AAA gaming, they're not going to be dumping the previous generation consoles like the PS5 or Xbox Series X, I guess. We'll see what they are, but they won't be dumping the PS5 at least for a very long time. And that bodes really well for the Switch 2, which I think if a PS5 game targets, a median resolution 60 FPS, then you can expect for most cases a at least 30 FPS targeting Switch 2 port. But it also depends whether or not a developer finds that the Switch 2 audience is the audience that they want to capture, if they can capture it, or if they're going to be competing with other titles where they don't think it'll sell enough. So, even now, the Switch 2 doesn't get every single game, right? But it gets a lot more than the Switch 1 definitely did.
Yeah. The question, Oliver, from my perspective is basically if the PS5 is going to be around well into the early 2030s, then everything should be fine for the Switch 2. I don't know what you think.
I actually think that maybe in the short term, what we're going to see with Switch 2 is a continuing flood of software that come from like last generation games and come from current generation games. What we saw last generation was that the software velocity slowed down as we got further into that generation, as games started to be developed for, higher and higher end platforms, and obviously the 360 and PS3 ports dried up, which were kind of the bread and butter of third-party support on Switch 1. I would expect that, though, to be a bit better on Switch 2, but I wouldn't be surprised if we're in a situation where in like the 2030s, a lot of the like low-hanging fruit has been exhausted, and a lot of the games that are being shipped on Switch 2 are, either not that plentiful or aren't that exciting in terms of what they're delivering, because they are 30 FPS titles, because they do have depressed image quality, or because they're operating on raster-only lighting paths that are largely deprecated, with developers moving on to, PlayStation 6, Xbox Helix, whatever, platforms that are capable of delivering a higher-end ray-traced experience. I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case, but I actually don't think it's that big of a deal regardless, because 50 cents of every eShop dollar, historically speaking, have been spent on Nintendo first-party software. So third-party presence on Switch 2 matters less than it does on other platforms. I'd still expect to see better support than we did for Switch 1 because of the presence of PlayStation 5 is an ongoing concern. But I actually don't think it matters. It's not the world to Nintendo if you're going to stop shipping games, because they'll still keep shipping games. So I think it will be okay regardless.
Okay, yeah, good stuff. Let's move on. Question here from Nathan. To whom it may concern. Okay, this one's going to be good. Why doesn't the gamer/gaming journalism communities understand or even mention inflation? People are getting sticker shock and saying gaming is dead because of prices, but the prices are actually very normal, at least in USD terms. But inflation is not just a USD phenomenon. PS3 launched at $843, Xbox 360 at $674. A $700 or $800 console is a serious expense, but no more so than consoles have been traditionally. Or in other words, consoles cost about the same as they always have, except the cheap edition shipped at launch instead of years later. Or in even more other words, consoles didn't get more expensive, the dollar just isn't valuable like it used to be. Why is this never mentioned when talking about the next generation of consoles being DOA? I kind of get what you're saying. There's two ways to look at it. Yes, nobody is looking at these sort of inflation-adjusted figures. And that kind of makes sense, right? And if you go back to the Super NES times when cartridges were quite expensive, obviously games are a lot more expensive relative to what they are today. I think the thing is that you can compare the now to then just on inflationary terms, but the world is a very different place as well, and a lot of things have got a lot more expensive owing to inflation. And gaming also has to compete with a lot of other things that that cost you money. That from that perspective, it's difficult. The other thing, of course, is that the nature of the games business has evolved into this kind of like mega mainstream thing when it perhaps wasn't quite as big as it was. Wasn't quite as big. Now as it was relative to before. Obviously, cost of living crisis, all of that stuff, you can't really look at things in a vacuum, would be my take on that. But I get what you're saying, that relative to now, things did cost more than we kind of expected to in the past. I think it's just one part of the equation, though. Alex, what do you think?
Yeah, I think another part of the equation that reinforces your line of thinking here and contravenes a little Nathan's, which is kind of saying like, oh, who cares? It's adjusted for inflation. It's not a big deal. The reason why I say that, there may be another thing along with inflation is that not like the way wages increase across the society is not
as
it's not an average. It's not as it was, like the lower strata may actually not have wage increases that align with inflation and may be far below it for decades now. And so what might have been a splurge Christmas gift in 1999 may actually be a serious investment that you cannot actually afford for your family anymore because years of, lower wages means you have less savings and you have to worry about other things. So along with the price competition Rich talked about from inflation of other goods. So I think this time around it is perhaps even worse than the PS3 price, just because I think the cost of consumer goods is competing with a whole other world which didn't exist at that point in time. And it's really only after 2008 that we started getting into the economics that we kind of live in now, I think.
What do you think, Oliver?
Well, I think in addition to the myriad factors that Alex and yourself had laid out, I think that the cost of alternatives has gone down radically. Like when you look at other entertainment products today, TikTok, YouTube, Netflix, they're all free or low cost, low monthly subscription, or they're available for free on your phone. Like, you scroll through a TikTok feed and it's like algorithmically curated content to perfectly suit your interests being delivered without any additional cost. Maybe you see the occasional ad, but it's really not too obtrusive. So I think in that environment, when you look at the alternatives, spending a lot of money on a game console probably is not that appealing. And then just in general, the cost of all kinds of consumer electronics has gone way, way down, I feel like. Like when the PlayStation 3 launched, a 40-inch TV, I had a 40-inch Bravia, 2005 model here, Bravia. And it was like 2,500 Canadian dollars. Nowadays, getting a television of similar size and much, much, much better quality would be, $200, 300 American dollars. That would be very cheap. It would not be very expensive. And then even the high-end model in like a 43-inch size would be like $400, $500. It would not be very expensive at all. The other thing is that I feel like back in the day, consoles benefited from the fact that they were home entertainment devices that competed with other high-end home entertainment devices for similar functionality. So you could spend $600 on a PlayStation 3, or you could spend $1,000 on a Blu-ray player, a Toshiba Blu-ray player.
Right.
Why wouldn't you spend the money on a PlayStation 3, get the Blu-ray player? That's really valuable functionality. Likewise with a PlayStation 2 or an Xbox or something and a DVD player. That's functionality that we've kind of given up. I mean, granted, a PlayStation 5 does replace media center functionality that you get on another device for Netflix or something. But now they're not competing with super expensive Blu-ray players. They're competing with super cheap Amazon TV Fire Sticks or something. Much, much cheaper devices. Or even like an Apple TV is a fraction of the price of a PlayStation 5. So I think it's just a totally different environment in terms of what people tolerate, in terms of what people expect to pay for entertainment experiences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I've just been doing some inflation calculations from stuff I bought in 2005, like my plasma TV. My God, it's like £6,300 now for plasma TV. Crazy stuff. Okay, let's move on. Question here from Stu Monster. Greetings, Foundryman, or quote unquote, your screen pals, as Mrs. Stu Monster refers to DF. Long time watcher, first time Q&A-er. Seeing Linux running on PlayStation 5 hardware got me thinking about Xbox's rumored Project Helix. If the rumors are accurate, Helix is essentially a Windows 11 based gaming OS running on relatively standard PC-like hardware, albeit within Microsoft's own hardware specifications. So my question is, could Microsoft produce a Project Helix style OS build that runs on existing Xbox Series XS consoles? And, I guess I'm best equipped to answer that. And I think the answer is yes, they could. The issue being primarily memory, especially for the Series S. What I'm finding with Linux on PlayStation 5 is that the games are not designed to run within that operating system. They're designed to run within an operating system or a developer environment where the games have total control over the unified memory. And there is no such control as such on Linux. So basically what I'm finding is that I'm having to make a lot of VRAM style mitigations, limitations that I wouldn't need to do to get the same games running on Linux on PlayStation 5, getting them running on on Linux. It's not great. It's really challenging. I would imagine that they could produce, they could run Windows 11 on Xbox Series X. They'd need to have some sort of very good memory management system on there. based on what I've seen on Linux anyway. I think Series S would be a write-off. I mean, what are you supposed to do about that when you've got so little memory to begin with? Alex, interesting question though, right? I mean, it could be done. It's one of those things that you could do it, but you probably shouldn't.
Yeah, I feel like it could be an interesting send-off for the Series X.
Right.
Like, you know, like we're not going to really be supporting normal Xbox apps anymore, because I don't think it makes much monetary sense to make developers make specific Xbox versions at some point in time. And then they'd say, but with your Xbox Series X, you can at least attempt it. That'd be a cool little send-off. Maybe they would do it. But I think, like you, the Series S makes that not a good, like it wouldn't work there. You're already struggling with it under Linux on the PS5, the memory there, and its Series S just doesn't have the memory. So I don't think they would do it actually then, even though it would be cool, because they've tried to at least treat Xbox Series X and S on equal footing over time. They've given some developers some leeway to not have great Series S versions or reduce a feature shortly before launch, as we've heard before. But yeah, I just, it's a cool idea, but I don't think it's going to happen.
Right. Oliver?
I concur. I think they could do it, but it's, you know, the question, could you do it? Should you do it? Those are two different questions. I don't think it would be very functional. And ultimately, like, I think that, you know, Microsoft just does not have much interest, I don't think, even, you know, despite some public messaging perhaps to the contrary. I don't think they have a lot of incentive to iterate heavily on Xbox Series, given that it's kind of a dead end, both as a platform and as a kind of continuing line of machines. They don't really want you to be shipping too many of those games, I suspect, into the deep future. I think they want you on PC, but I also don't think that PC experience would really work on those consoles.
Yeah, I think it would be a lot of effort for no real reward for Microsoft. It would lead to sort of not particularly great experiences, and it would take those consoles that are locked to their ecosystem out of their ecosystem for a lot of game playing experiences, which they probably wouldn't want to do. Yeah, I can see it being a cool thing, but probably not worth doing. I think it's probably would be quite easy for them to do, mind you, as a sort of one and done thing, and then you just sort of let Windows take care of everything else. But, you know, I just don't think it's probably worth it for the end user. Okay, let's move on. Minty Hippo asks, although it's not going to be a traditionally quote-unquote cheap console, will Project Helix being PC-based lead to a possible conflict between consumers and business users using them as cost-effective work machines or possibly for AI compute? While I'm excited at the possibilities of third-party game stores and the flexibility of software on this new platform, that openness might make it even harder to acquire as an end user if Microsoft Office or Alarma can run on it. That's an interesting point of view, isn't it, Oliver?
I do. I would not be that worried about Microsoft Office, though, just because I don't expect... I mean, if this box is subsidized at all, which remains to be seen, and I personally have some doubts about that a little bit, I don't think it'll be in the price range where it would be suitable as an office computer. I think people are looking for, like, $400 machines as office computers, $500 machines as office computers, and if this console is at that price, I'll eat my hat. I don't think it'll be anywhere close to that. I'd also say that, you know, a lot of this question about local AI, it's not just flops, it's also memory capacity, driver maturity, model compatibility, ecosystem. Like AMD needs to build an AI ecosystem that's actually good for people. I think NVIDIA has done that on PC. I think Apple has done that on Mac. I don't think AMD has done it to this point on PC with their own graphics hardware. So if they don't deliver an ecosystem, it's not really worth it for local AI development, because that would be so appropriate. And then, of course, with local AI stuff, mostly we're talking about very high-end graphics cards. And I imagine by the time those ships, AMD will have higher-end offerings. That might just dwarf the capability of this, the reason for having this. But I also think that there's probably some potential for Microsoft, if they really wanted to possibly cripple this in software, or at least make your life difficult for you if you want to do local AI development on this. I don't know if they would do that necessarily, but ultimately, like, I think all those factors will weigh against it. And then also the fact that I don't expect, like, I'm not sure how much of a discount this will get relative to commodity PC hardware, especially from NVIDIA being like the easier pathway for a lot of this AI stuff in the first place.
Right, yeah, that's an interesting point. The idea of limiting it via drivers is a viable possibility, though, because they're going to be in control of the driver. Interesting. Alex?
Well, I'd just be pissed that I bought something that is being stupendously driver limited. Although Nvidia does in driver limiting for its hardware too in the past, so it wouldn't be a first exactly. Here, I guess we have to see. Like bots buying out everything day one for this thing could happen regardless.
Yeah.
If it's like some sort of AI compute machine that people want to throw into server racks or something, which I don't think will happen. So it is a possibility, but at the same time, I don't think that's. I think there's like Oliver said, like the environment would have to exist to make that actually something that people readily do. And I don't think it currently exists within the AMD software portfolio. So as a result, I don't think that will be the day one experience of people buying this thing up for AI. Rather, people might buy it up for other reasons and then resell it to you on eBay. As terrible as that is.
Okay, let's move on. A question here from the newly knighted Sir Toby. I didn't see that in the honours list, but there we are. Sir Toby asks, greetings, DF. Just want your thoughts on PC emulation on Android. Could we see a next generation NVIDIA Shield, the TV one, or is an ARM Steam machine a better option? Alex, what do you think about this? I think ultimately all of this stuff comes down to the quality of x86 translation to ARM, which is kind of like still up in the air a bit at the moment. There's no real sort of big testing done on this as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, there isn't. I think an NVIDIA Shield would be great, but I don't think that's the core focus right now for NVIDIA's next ARM release, which will come coupled with as part of an SoC with a nice GPU and a flexible amount of memory going up to very high amounts. So I don't think it's going to be targeting a smaller TV adjacent device, rather things like laptops or maybe really cool all-in-ones. Rather, I do think this is something that Valve is thinking about because they have the Steam frame, right? Oliver took a look at that. And that is, I forget the name. What is it called? Flex? What is the name of the
Vex?
translation?
Yes, Vex. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Sorry, I forget the name of it, but I think Valve is like the large investment behind that initiative.
Yeah.
And I think Valve long term wants to have greater flexibility for how it can make the Steam library available in the future. And ARM is going to be part of that story because otherwise you're just dealing constantly only with the sole x86 SoC provider that they've been able to work with in the past, and that is AMD. And the entire industry isn't just wedded to x86 anymore like it was in the past. ARM is now a more serious consideration, including things like running on Mac devices. So I think if anyone here in the future, it would be Valve pushing ARM even more so than Microsoft, as funny as that is, especially for the gaming sphere and actually making a translation layer that is competitive with native running. And in which case I would say not an ARM Steam machine, but some sort of Steam device, maybe the next gen. I don't know. I don't know what it would be. But the Steam frame makes me think that Valve actually do have this in sight.
Yeah. I mean, the N1 and N1X processors from NVIDIA, I guess, a new Shield could be like a small set-top box style thing. Very, very small micro style device. I think that would be pretty cool. Oliver, what do you think?
That would be really cool. I think that it's certainly a much more interesting prospect running these kinds of high-end games on something that can actually, expend some thermal envelope on something like a DGX Spark or something like this N1 or N1X processor, which are obviously basically the same thing as a DGX Spark. I think that'd be very interesting. I think at the moment, I am seeing a lot of interesting exploration of PC games running on Android devices. But the key limitation there just seems to be the fact they're Android devices, they're fanless, they have low thermal mass, they're not that powerful in many cases. These phones are not that great, these tablets are not that great, and the games themselves don't seem to be super stable. I know that people are doing some probably fairly aggressive things like they're doing frame generation at base frame rates of like 20 FPS in some cases I've seen. That's not too promising, but I do think that the hardware is a key limiting factor that you need to eliminate in order to really evaluate these kinds of projects on the basis of their kind of compatibility and performance. Because at the moment, you know, a PS5 game is just not going to run that well. Like a lot of these games are just not going to run that well if they're designed for higher end systems on a phone, regardless of how good the translation is.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. I think ultimately it comes down to the quality of ARM gaming on the Steam library, or the PC gaming library more generally. And I guess we just need to wait to see how that pans out when we do see the N1 and the N1X processors, because obviously couple of years down the road, we're going to be getting integrated processors with Intel CPUs and NVIDIA GPUs, which could be a bit more interesting for gaming, shall we say. But, you know, really interested in seeing what N1 and N1X are going to actually manifest as and how good they are as games machines. I think ARM is probably quite an important target for Steam, but in a kind of medium to long range facility. Okay, let's move on. Quick question here from Marcus. Hiya, Foundryman, exclamation point. A lot of PC gamers are now upgrading from older systems built around GTX 10 series Pascal GPUs and CPUs from roughly the same era. Once that newer kit arrives, what do you think people can realistically do with the old hardware rather than just letting it gather dust? Could those older PCs still make sense as living room gaming systems, indie or retro machines, Steam streaming boxes, home servers, capture PCs, or starter rigs for friends and family? Are there any uses you would avoid because of powered raw driver support, media features, or general platform limitations? Hope you have a great week! Exclamation point. Interesting question, right, Alex? Because, you know, we're talking in the Direct last week about the 10-year anniversary of Pascal, and yeah, maybe it is time now to move on from your GTX 1080 and 1080 Ti, certainly 1060. But, you know, relative to, say, what a Steam Deck is doing, for example, it's still a lot of GPU power that you've got there.
Yeah, I mean, if you're really keen on using it for one of these purposes that were described here, especially like a living room gaming system, it could be really good for those kind of things. I personally think the most interesting to do this is give it to a friend or family, because historically in the past, when I have had hardware I don't use anymore, I don't throw it in an attic or in a basement. I usually give it to a friend or a family member, cousin, whatnot, whoever is like tangentially interested in PC gaming. And then, you know, they have finally the hardware hook there to get invested in it, and they start playing games with their friends, or, you know, do whatever with it that they want. I think that is much more interesting, because for things like a streaming box, there are going to be more power efficient alternatives that will be cheaper over time. They will not be as loud, as dust heavy as a normal large PC would have been. Home server market, I also would say you could technically do it, but there could be more power efficient ways to do that, and would be a cheap investment for most people. Starter rigs, I really think that is the place to go with it. But if you really did want to use it for some sort of lower power, less often used thing, what you could do, especially from this period, on the Intel side, unfortunately, a lot of the processors were built to be at like the thermal limits. So I would recommend downclocking them a bit, giving them a bit less juice. Maybe even that could apply to the GPU. Maybe you'd want to undervolt it, and then let it be used for the purpose that you saw fit earlier. Because I think a lot of these, Pascal was okay though, wattage wise, but I think a lot of the i7s from this period were